In November of 1887, a county surveyor named Elias Tabb rode out from the mouth of the Poquoson River with a notebook, a plumb line, and a waterman named Solomon Custalow, whose family had worked those flats for longer than anyone in Gloucester County could account for. Custalow was Pamunkey by birth, though he had spent his working life among the oystermen of the Lower Bay, and on that particular morning he was not interested in oysters. 2 nights earlier, an unusually low tide had pulled back further than he had seen it pull in years, and it had left something showing on the flats that he wanted a white man with a surveyor's commission to see for himself, because he already knew what would happen to his own word alone. The morning was cold and still, the kind of dead calm winter tide that pulls the bay back further than a chart ever admits it will go, and Custalow had rowed out before first light to be certain the water had not already started its return by the time he brought Tabb to see it. Tabb climbed down onto it at low water in his boots, and later, in the notebook that survives today in the Gloucester County Courthouse records, he wrote that he had stood on a floor, not a sandbar, not a shoal, a floor, laid level and hard, with the stubs of posts still standing in it at even intervals, as though a house, or several houses, had once stood on ground the bay had since taken back. Custalow told him plainly that the old people had always spoken of a town under the water there, a Powhatan town, emptied and lost to the bay before the English ever came up the river, and that his own grandmother had once pointed to that stretch of water from a boat and told him it was not a place to fish alone after dark. Tabb wrote the account down in the same steady hand he used for property lines and tax parcels. He did not say he believed all of it. He measured the floor before the tide came back in and buried it again, and he kept the notebook for the rest of his life. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Tabb had found, though he did not yet have the language for it, was a floor of packed marl clay, roughly 40 feet long and perhaps 18 feet across, ringed by postholes cut into the clay at intervals of about 2 feet, the kind of spacing a builder uses when a wall is meant to hold weight and not merely mark a boundary. Mixed into the clay were crushed oyster shell, charred hickory nutshell, and the broken lip of a shell-tempered pot, thick-walled and plain, the kind that potters along the York and the Pamunkey had been making for centuries before any European set foot on this coast. None of that, taken alone, was strange. Shell middens and post-mold floors turn up along the Chesapeake shoreline with some regularity, the leavings of a people who lived on this water for thousands of years before the English arrived, and thousands more after they left. What was strange was the water itself. The floor Tabb stood on lay under 6 feet of bay at low tide, inside a channel the county charts had shown as open water since the earliest English surveys of the 1600s. A shell-tempered pot does not walk into a channel on its own. A packed clay floor does not build itself under the tide. Something had once stood on dry ground, and the ground under it had gone. Custalow was not the only waterman who could point to that stretch of the flats and say a story belonged to it. Tabb's notebook records 2 more names, a waterman called Isaiah Weeks and a woman named Nancy Tyler Langston, both of whom told him, separately and without prompting from the other, that the water off the Poquoson carried a story older than any deed in the courthouse. A town had stood there once. Its people had left it before the bay ever came up over the ground, not drowned in their houses the way a much later town on the far side of the country would be drowned with its residents still inside, but emptied out ahead of the water by people who seemed to have known, or feared, what was coming. The 3 accounts did not agree in every particular, the way 3 independent accounts almost never do. They agreed on the shape of it, a town, a withdrawal ahead of the rising water, and a floor a person could still stand on if the tide fell far enough on the right morning and they knew exactly where to look. Tabb did what a county surveyor in 1887 was expected to do with a find like that. He wrote to Washington. The Bureau of American Ethnology had been open for 8 years by then under John Wesley Powell, gathering precisely this kind of report from precisely this kind of corner of the Atlantic seaboard, racing to record what remained of native settlement before the shoreline, the plough, and the passing of the old people who still remembered it took the rest away. Powell's field agents were, in those same years, working the river valleys of the interior and the mound country of the Ohio and the Mississippi, and a report from a Tidewater County surveyor describing a submerged floor rather than an earthwork on dry ground would have sat oddly against the kind of sight the Bureau's staff was accustomed to chasing. Tabb could not have known that. He wrote what he had measured and sent it north, and trusted the office to know what to do with it. The Bureau's own incoming correspondence ledger for that winter survives in fragments in the National Archives, and it shows a letter logged from Gloucester County, Virginia, dated to early December of that year, catalogued in the same careful clerk's hand used for every other entry on the page. A line further down, the entry is crossed through. No outgoing reply is recorded anywhere in the surviving files. No field agent was dispatched to Gloucester County that winter or the one after it. Whatever the Bureau made of Elias Tabb's floor under the tide, it never became one of the sites its surveyors visited in the seasons that followed, and the ledger simply stops accounting for the letter at the exact point where a decision should have been made. The Gloucester County Clerk's Register has its own gap sitting beside Tabb's find, and it is a stranger one because it belongs to a different office entirely. The register logs land surveys by date in a clerk's steady, unbroken hand, page after page without a missed working day, for years on either side of that winter. For 11 days following Tabb's second visit to the flats, the register is blank. The next entry, dated 11 days later, is written in the same hand and the same ink, taking up exactly where a surveyor's log resumes after a routine break in the weather. No storm appears in the shipping notices out of Norfolk for those 11 days. No holiday falls across them. The gap carries no explanation of its own. It simply sits, blank, inside a book that otherwise accounts for every working day a county surveyor spent on that water that entire winter. A clerk's register does not usually go quiet for reasons that leave no trace at all, and the surviving correspondence of the clerk's office for that period, thin as it is, offers nothing that accounts for the missing days either. Elias Tabb kept surveying for another 20 years, and his name appears on property plats across 3 counties well into the new century. What his name does not appear on again, in any surviving record, is antiquities. The man who filed a measured account of a submerged clay floor and 3 independent witness statements in 1887 never filed another word about native settlement, remains for the rest of his working life, though the Chesapeake shoreline handed plenty of shell middens and post-mold floors to other surveyors across those same 20 years. He took county commissions, he surveyed farmland and timber tracts, and when a local newspaper asked him in 1904 about the old stories of a drowned town on the Poquoson Flats, the surviving clipping quotes him saying only that the tide moves the mud around out there, and that a man can convince himself of a great many things standing in 6 feet of water at dawn. It is a strange thing for the same man to say who once knelt in that water with a plumb line and measured the post holes one by one. Tabb's flats were not the only place along this coast where a floor showed up under water it had no business being under. In 1896, an oyster dredge captain working the mouth of the Piankatank River, a man named Reuben Forrest, brought a county agent out to a spot where his dredge kept fouling on what he swore was cut timber and not a snag. The agent's brief written report, filed with the county and later reprinted in a Richmond paper, describes the same packed clay, the same shell-tempered pottery fragments, and the same account from local watermen of a town that had stood there before the water rose over it. In 1920, a lighthouse keeper stationed off Tangier Island logged in his own station book a similar floor, briefly exposed by an unusually low tide, along with post stubs he described as standing in rows too even to be driftwood settled by chance. 3 sites, 3 separate decades. 3 men with no apparent connection to one another, working different stretches of the same bay, and in every case the same material signature: packed clay, evenly spaced posts, shell-tempered pottery, and a story from the people who worked that water that the ground had once been dry, and that something had stood on it before the bay took it back. Forrest's report and the lighthouse keeper's station log were not written for each other, and neither man had any reason to know the other's account existed. The Piankatank and Tangier sites sit more than 30 miles apart by open water, on opposite shores of the lower bay, which makes the matching detail in the post spacing harder to wave off as one waterman echoing a story he had heard second-hand from another. What is consistent across all three cases is not only the physical description, it is what happened afterward. In each case, a report went somewhere official, and in each case, official interest went nowhere further. No excavation was mounted at the Piankatank site. No survey team ever followed up at Tangier. The reports exist, filed and occasionally reprinted in a local paper, and each one simply stops. On a page where a decision should have followed, the same way Tabb's letter to the Bureau simply stops. None of this requires anything hidden to explain the water itself. The Chesapeake Bay is, in the plainest geological sense, a drowned river valley, the old channel of the Susquehanna and its tributaries, flooded as the last ice age ended, and the water locked away in glaciers came home to the ocean. That flooding did not stop once the bay settled into its familiar outline on a map. It has continued, slowly, for thousands of years, and it is still continuing now, taking marsh and low shoreline at a pace people who live on the bay can watch happen inside a single lifetime. Whole islands inhabited within living memory, Holland Island among them, have gone under entirely within the last 100 years, their houses undermined and pulled down by water that used to stop well short of the front porch. A town on a low rise off the Poquoson, standing on ground the bay eventually wanted back, is not a strange claim set against that record. It is an ordinary one, only older and pushed further down. What is strange is not that a Powhatan town could have stood on ground the Chesapeake later reclaimed. What is strange is how consistently, across three separate reports spanning more than 30 years, the trail of anyone taking that claim seriously goes cold at the same point, on the same kind of page, in the same unfinished way. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. If the floor under Elias Tabb's boots was what 3 generations of watermen said it was, it asks something of this coastline that most histories of it do not account for. It asks whether the Powhatan world the English met in 1607 was already a diminished version of a larger one, a confederacy of river towns that had, within the memory of its own elders, already lost ground to the water before it lost anything to the colony. The English who wrote the earliest accounts of the Powhatan people described a paramount chiefdom of roughly 30 towns spread along the rivers feeding the bay, its authority centered at Werowocomoco on the York, a real place, since rediscovered and excavated, its palisade lines and ceremonial ditches confirmed by archaeologists working the site in the 2000s. Even Captain John Smith's own writings, drawn from his time among the Powhatan in those first years, mention towns already reduced or standing empty by the time the English arrived to count them, casualties, in Smith's telling, of wars and shifting alliances among the river towns. What those same accounts never explain, because no one in a position to record it thought to ask the question in a form the written record could hold, is how many of those towns had gone under the water itself, rather than under a rival chief's authority, by the time anyone with a pen arrived to take the count. The Powhatan towns the English did meet and name, Werowocomoco chief among them, sat almost without exception on high, defensible ground above the tide line, a siting choice archaeologists studying the region have long attributed to farmland and fresh water. It is also, plainly, the siting choice of a people who had learned, at some point in a past their own oral tradition still carried, exactly what the low ground along this bay was capable of doing to a town. Most of what surfaced from the Chesapeake in these accounts went back under with the next tide, or into a report a bureau ledger later crossed off its own page. One piece did not. A single fired clay fragment, roughly the size of a thumb, its surface scored with the fine cord-marked pattern typical of woodland period Chesapeake pottery, sits today in a wooden cigar box in a private home in Gloucester County, passed down through 5 generations of the Tabb family alongside the notebook it was found beside. It has never been catalogued by a museum, it has never been carbon dated. By any formal standard, it is an unverified curiosity, a family keepsake with a story attached, rather than a specimen with a documented chain of custody. The current owner of the box, a great-great-grandson of Elias Tabb, has shown it to visiting historians twice in the last 30 years, and both times declined to have it removed from the house for testing, a decision that keeps the fragment out of any formal collection, but also, so far, out of any drawer where a piece like it might quietly go missing. It exists, sitting in a box in a house less than an hour's drive from the flats where Elias Tabb once stood at low tide with a plumb line, and it is the one physical piece of that 1887 report that the water, the Bureau's ledger, and 140 years of quiet did not manage to lose. The spacing of those post holes deserves one more look before this account closes, because it is the detail that resists the easiest explanation. 2 feet, center to center, along every wall Tabb measured that morning, a tolerance he recorded to within an inch across a floor 40 feet long. Driftwood does not arrange itself at even intervals. Silt does not settle into a grid. Whoever drove those posts into the clay was working from a plan, a set of paces or a length of cord carried from post to post. The same quiet engineering discipline visible in longhouse floors excavated on dry land up and down this coast, at Werowokomoko and elsewhere, where post holes fall into rows with a consistency that still surprises the archaeologists who map them. The flats off the Poquoson do not show a different kind of building. They show the same kind of building, in the same regional tradition, in a place where no one now living was supposed to find a floor to measure at all. The Gloucester County Register still holds its 11 blank days sitting inside an otherwise unbroken run of entries. The Bureau of American Ethnology's incoming letter is still logged, still crossed through, with no reply on file in any collection researchers have located since. Elias Tabb still told a newspaperman in 1904 that the tide moves the mud around, 17 years after he had written, in his own steady hand, a measured account of a floor, evenly spaced post holes, and 3 independent witnesses who called it a town. The flats off the Poquoson still go under at ordinary high water, and still, on the lowest tides of the year, show a stretch of packed ground that does not behave the way a sandbar behaves. Whatever stood on that rise was raised by people who had a name for it, a reason for leaving it, and a memory of it long enough and strong enough to still be handed to watermen and county surveyors 2.5 centuries later. Solomon Custalow is buried in a churchyard not far from the Pamunkey River, and the family that carries his name still works the water he grew up on, though none of them, as far as any surviving record shows, ever went looking for the floor again. The bay took the town, it did not take the memory, and for one low morning in 1887, with a plumb line in his hand and a Pamunkey waterman standing beside him in the mud, it did not manage to take the floor either. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.